My name is Cody Walls, and I'm a staff psychologist at Counseling Services. And in addition to my role as a therapist, I also run the stress management program and also coordinate the Feel Better Fast workshops and the biofeedback program. So I'm so glad you folks could come. And again, I apologize for the delay. So obviously today we're going to talk a little bit about stress and emotions. And to outline a little bit of what we're planning on doing in the next 45 minutes is discuss the two most common emotional responses to distress, understand how to accept and experience our emotions, which can sometimes be pretty challenging, and then discuss ways to decrease negative impacts of emotional responses to stress. Any questions about that before we go? Okay. So what do you folks think are the two emotions that are the most common responses to distress? And there's a delay, so when you turn it on, just give it like 2 beats. Okay, what do you think? Can hold the mic to your face.
Stress and fear.
Good, yes. So heard one emotion for sure. Anybody have ideas what the other one might be? Yeah, can we pass this to him? Little did you know you were going to have to work in this presentation.
Anger.
Yes, perfect. So great job. You all worked it out together. So, bit of admission, I have not seen the movie, but as you can imagine, Inside Out has a lot of practicality with this presentation. So anger is definitely a component of stress. Fear is another component to stress. But then sometimes there's this phenomenon with stress that, because you think about the negative aspects of being stressed, and that's typically defined as distress. But then there's also this component called eustress, which is sort of the excited anticipation of something that's going to be positive. So if you think about, going on a date, starting a new job, being in a class that you really enjoy, going to see something or someone you're really looking forward to, and that typically is shown as joy. We won't spend as much time talking about joy. So we're going to focus on anger and fear. But good job, and way to play along, everybody. So in terms of this idea of anger and fear, they tend to be viewed as two sides of the same coin. So they're both activated by stimuli that are perceived as being a threat. And we'll talk a little bit about the fight or flight response as it relates to these emotions. But just sort of to reflect on your own experience and maybe to describe to folks who may not have an idea about what these emotions might feel like, what do these emotions feel like physically in your body? If you had to describe maybe anger to somebody, do you want to give it a shot since you've got the mic? Or do you still? Okay.
Like sweating.
Good, yes.
Yeah.
Sweating. Could also be nervousness too, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, good. Any other thoughts with anger?
Heartbeat.
Heartbeat in terms of what?
It gets going faster.
Yes, gets going faster. Good. Do you two have any thoughts about anger or fear? What that might feel like in your body?
Yeah, you get kind of hot. I mean, that goes along with sweating.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
I also feel like your head gets kind of clouded.
Gets kind of clouded. Okay. What does it tend to be filled with if it's getting clouded?
A lot of really negative, angry thoughts.
Sure. Yeah, good. What about fear? Do we have any thoughts about that? Do you want to give it a shot? You don't have to if you don't want to.
Chest can get really tight. Can't breathe as well.
Good, yeah. That's pretty easy, and it's a very restrictive feeling versus maybe the more expansive of anger. Good. Any other thoughts for fear, since all of you have talked? Good job. So I realize I put you on the spot with this, and we know when we're feeling angry or afraid pretty easily. It's sometimes difficult to articulate those things. So kind of understanding maybe where parts of that come from can help us manage those emotions most effectively. So typically with a stress response, you have a fight, flight, or freeze response. And what that looks like is we have these hormones that get activated in our systems when we experience a threat, and it drives us to either fight the threat, however we might be able to do that, or we're to run away and try to just self-preserve. And oftentimes because we don't have saber-toothed tigers chasing us around campus anymore, we tend to sort of think about these threatening scenarios in a little safer way sometimes. So stepping off a curb in front of a car, while that's dangerous and can be life-threatening, you can react pretty quickly, relatively. Sometimes we think about threatening scenarios as interacting with people. Could also be interacting with an exam that we don't feel prepared for, that's really important to us. And having those sort of threatening perceptions can activate those symptoms. So feelings of anger typically initiate the fight response, which makes sense, I hope. And then the feelings of fear often initiate the flight response. And sometimes with this freeze aspect, when we freeze, it's almost like we're rolling through our Rolodex of survival techniques. So it helps you orientate to this situation, and then also helps you pull out the thing that might be most effective based on what you've experienced in the past. Does that kind of make sense? Okay. Both of these emotions are survival emotions. However, our big brains can sometimes cause more harm than good. And this kind of goes back to the idea that we don't have large, threatening, physically intimidating things that come at us, but we can create scenarios in our mind that activate these same emotions without an actual threat being present. So we'll talk a little bit about anger first. So in terms of the anatomy of anger, anger for both men and women is often seen as one of the most uncomfortable of all human emotions. And a lot of that has to do with the way that people express anger. Maybe you grew up in a family where somebody was explosive if they got angry. And that sort of taught you that it wasn't okay to express anger because it wasn't done safely or in a way that anything productive came from it. Other times there is that sort of, it could be a straightforward direct message, or it could be this overt understanding, or covert, where you are taught that you should never express your anger because it might jeopardize a relationship, and then what do you do in that situation? So people sometimes contain those emotions, and it can be detrimental to one's health. Let's see, kind of going back to the physiological responses of anger and frustration, when we get angry, you get the heart rate increasing, you get that sort of flood of emotion. They've done temperature reads of folks when they've experienced different emotions, and literally when someone is angry, they're pretty much red hot all over. But then when someone's afraid or sad even, then that tends to be a lot cooler overall, except for like the internal organs where you have to sort of keep warm to stay alive. And then again, it can also do with the messages we receive about our own anger and that frustration. So why, if it's so uncomfortable, do we want to actually experience? And I think that is because anger can literally help us survive. Charles Darwin, the evolutionist biologist, talks a lot about this idea of a rage reflex. And this is present in all animals. And again, it goes back to that fight or flight response that we all experience regardless, as long as we have brain functioning. And when you have this rage reflex, it pumps those hormones through your body, and you can physically change or affect your environment in such a way that it increases your chances of survival. So it's really important for us to have. What's unique about humans is that we are one of the only species to be able to have delayed anger response. This sometimes looks like vengeance. So if any of you have experienced something where someone slighted you and you aren't maybe able to deal with it in the moment, but you kind of hold it back and you ruminate on it and you think about it and you get more and more angry as you think about it, then you can sort of craft an idea of how you would want to get back at them, so to speak. And we also, with this aspect, can behave aggressively for inexplicable reasons. So oftentimes if you think about intimate partner violence or domestic abuse, then you have a person who's a perpetrator and maybe they have a lot of stress in their life legitimately. And it's really hard to manage their feelings of loss of control and powerlessness. So what they do is they come home and then they inflict it on people who are themselves powerless in that scenario. So it's misdirected anger in lots of ways. There are some myths about anger and rage. So the first one is that aggressive behavior is universal. This is not the case. If you kind of look at anthropological and sociological studies, they can demonstrate that even though anger is a universal emotion experienced by many, aggressive behavior is not instinctual. So we learn to be aggressive to other people. In some other cultures, particularly those in Asian cultures, they are more likely to do things like rejection, social rejection, so kind of ignoring them or the person that they're angry with, even doing sometimes dream interpretations as a way to help process through some of that anger and to have a better connection with that individual. which is sometimes very different from maybe what you would think of as the typical Western approach to anger. And the second myth is that aggression is the direct result of frustration. And I have notes here that I'm going to refer to. So again, it's often more common to express anger by withdrawing or avoiding and fasting sometimes, which I don't often think of as an option for dealing with frustration or anger. So that was sort of new to me as I was preparing for this. And this also suggests aggressive behavior is only one of several possible responses to feelings of frustration. Any questions about that before we go? Okay. Typically, as we kind of talked about, and this might be one of the reasons why it's hard to allow ourselves to fully experience anger as it could be, is because we often associate it with the darker aspects of humanity. If you think about Virginia Tech, for example, that was a person who was pretty angry about what was going on, and rather than trying to find an effective way to manage his rage, he then took it out on people who had no bearing on what had happened to him and weren't the perpetrators of his distress and destruction. And despite its negative reputation in terms of anger, it has a place in human interactions because it goes back to it's a very activating emotion, and it's a really effective form of communication when done right. And because it's often the most direct one. And it reveals important things to ourselves about our values and our morals and the things that we find most important in life. I want to talk a little bit about anger and gender. So research has demonstrated time and time again that the way men and women, if we're looking at just gender as dichotomous, which is not, but most of the studies tend to look at men or women, and it's often very different. So as you can see from the slide, and then I will also say, men are often given permission to express their anger outwardly. And they can not necessarily be aggressive and violent, but it's more socially acceptable for a man when he gets angry to shout or to yell or maybe even denigrate other people, while a woman doesn't have that sort of luxury. She's expected to sort of swallow her anger and do what she needs to do to continue to survive. And oftentimes this internalizing of anger, because she can't manage that in the same way that a man can sort of morph into this shame piece. And shame about feeling anger at somebody, which also might have a direct connection with some of the depressive symptoms and depressive rates you see with women compared to men, which women tend to have higher rates of depression than men. And so there's some theories kind of floating around that is that depression internalized anger, and how do you kind of manage it? Any questions about that? Any thoughts? Anything? Okay. So talk a little bit about physiological responses to anger, and you did a really good job of addressing that a little bit. So early studies on physical responses to both anger and fear showed marked differences in peripheral vasodilation. So that's a lovely technical term to talk about blood flow to the extremities. So anger produces a flushed face, as you kind of described. It tends to be hot all over, but fear does the opposite and pulls blood inward and toward the center of the body. So your extremities are a lot colder, and you sort of want to pull into yourself and hide. So that's what it looks like in the body. And in terms of the relationship between stress and disease, because it's obviously part of the stress management program, is anger and hostility have direct links to coronary heart disease. So if you've ever heard of the personality types, where there's like type A personality, they're like very driven and they're go-getters, but they also can be rigid and have difficulty managing their tempers. These are the type of folks that when they're behind the wheel, if somebody doesn't obey traffic laws or doesn't do what they expect them to, they're going to be on their horn, shouting at them, maybe making hand gestures out the window. These are the type of folks that you're most likely to see the connection between a heart attack or some sort of heart disease, high blood pressure, those kind of things. So talking a little bit about diffusing anger in a healthy way. Current research on anger in a therapeutic context, which obviously that's my sort of frame of reference for work with emotions, is to acknowledge anger as a normal, healthy emotional reaction. And that with this, you're validating and legitimizing that experience. Kind of going back to family of origin type stuff, if you come from a family that it wasn't okay to be angry, you can then internalize those messages and develop your own shame about feeling anger and frustration. And sometimes, like, anger can seem illegitimate. It's like, why are you so angry about this? It's not that big of a deal. Sometimes that's true. Other times it's a way to invalidate that emotion, and to sort of accept it as part of you as a whole person can really empower you to make changes for your life. So, and then going back to I talked about the suppression, and there's a typo, I see that now, my mistake. Or when their anger's suppressed or expressed violently, those are the two problematics, and they're two opposite ends of the spectrum. So we want to kind of bring us into the middle. So there was this idea that they talked about, and this comes back from the ancient Greeks, with this idea of catharsis. And typically with ancient Greeks, you would do the theater, and you would have 3 plays. And each of those plays would sort of build to a climax of catharsis, where you have this huge emotional experience, and then there's release and relief from that. But with anger, that is one emotion that they have found that just this random venting process does not work as effectively as they thought it did at one point. So the way to sort of combat that is to have sort of an approach of love and compassion and empathy as the most effective means. Now, I will say this. It is difficult to say this part of the most effective way to manage anger, when in reality, these are probably the emotions that you are farthest away from when you are angry. So sometimes you have to take a few moments, take a step back from the situation, even take a deep breath, and start to kind of process your own emotional reaction as it's happening. So I want to talk a little bit about, hey, that's not accurately done. So to generate healthy catharsis, the following criteria should be met. The expression of anger must be cast in the direction of the provocation, which means that if say your best friend or your romantic partner does something that makes you angry, maybe they forgot to pick you up, maybe they forgot that you had made plans, it doesn't help you to, one, suppress that anger, and it also doesn't help you to then contact another friend or maybe your parents and complain to them about what happened, and then never address the issue with the person that it happened to. Now, sometimes this can be more or less safe, so you have to be mindful in the situations that you're in when you're going to confront a person or a system that's done wrong, and know that you can effectively be able to manage your own safety. And sometimes that's a balancing act, but you all would know that better than I would. The expression of anger must restore a sense of self-control, so revenge is not a viable option. Although they've done some studies that show when people contemplate revenge, they actually get little bursts of endorphins and dopamine, so happy hormones, which is sort of ironic because it's not helpful in the long run, but in the moment it's very satisfying. And this self-control sometimes is not that you can resolve the issue immediately, but it's the sense that the person heard you out, or that you were able to just express what was happening for you. And the expression of anger must change the behavior of the provoker or provide insight to create a personal resolution. So this goes back to, you can't always affect someone and make them change and make them the way that you want them to be. So at times it may take that personal reflection piece where you recognize that maybe this isn't a person I should have in my life, or this isn't something that I can actually do and manage my experiences effectively. So anger must also be expressed in understandable language, so be direct. In our polite white society that most of us are raised in, we are not direct. We don't like to look at somebody and say, look, you really hurt my feelings when you did this, because it's hard and it can feel aggressive. But in reality, this is the type of thing that's most effective at managing anger and helping kind of heal that frustration. And the expression of anger must not provoke retaliation. And this kind of plays into that revenge piece. So you can go to somebody and kind of confront them about what they made you angry about, but in reality, it can't be to the point where you're then perpetuating and perpetrating on them in that process. Then I think I got one more. Oh, I guess I don't. Any questions about those pieces before we go on? Okay. So there's 4 types of anger mismanagement styles that we'll talk about. So there's the passive style, and this first one is called somaticizers. And what that means is it's a passive behavior style that takes a great toll on one's body. So somaticizers are individuals who choose not to express their emotions and feelings overtly, but rather suppress them for fear of rejection or loss of approval from others. And that can be so tricky because relationships are really important, but at the sacrifice of yourself and your own well-being, it's not worth it. And that takes time sometimes to recognize. With this particular mismanagement of anger, it tends to be, you see it in physical symptoms. So if any of you are the type of person who gets migraines or tension headaches when you've had a pretty intense emotional interaction with another person, or even sometimes more chronic issues like ulcers, ulcerative colitis has been linked with some of this sort of internalizing of anger and suppression. So if this is you, be mindful of the toll it's taking on your body and consider some of these alternatives for managing anger. The next one is self-punishers, and these folks tend to channel their anger into guilt. In other words, I should not have gotten angry at you. I'm a bad person because I got angry at you. And that goes back to the invalidation of the emotion. And this often comes with the piece of a control measure. So you get angry at somebody and then you internalize it by feeling guilt and shame about being angry at another person. And then so you try to restrict and you try to control, which means you try to suppress those emotions in total. And then the sort of rippling effect is you have the potential of having all of your emotions dimmed, even those more positive emotions like happiness and joy. And also with self-punishers tends to come this lowered self-esteem significantly. Then we have the active styles. So you have the exploders, and this is the stereotypical uncontrolled aggression. So they express anger in hostile manners, either verbally or physically, and they often erupt at people or options that have nothing to do with the cause of their frustration. As I mentioned before, like domestic abuse or intimate partner violence typically can be seen with this. This one's also used as a way to intimidate and maintain control over a situation. Because if you think about it, if you're coming to somebody expressing a concern and then they explode at you, you're going to learn pretty quickly that it's not okay to go to them with issues of concern or anything. So they're subtly pulling themselves away and creating a barrier between you, for better or worse. Then this other piece is underhanders, and this is the typical passive-aggressive type person. And for these folks, they inflict mild abuse on individuals in his or her proximity. And what separates underhanded behavior from the explosive style is that with the exploders, they typically just lash out at anybody and everybody who's around. But the underhanders actually target the person that they're angry with, but they do so indirectly. So for example, underhanders might show up late for meetings, show up late for class, not call back, not email back right away. And these are kind of pieces where it's like, I can't handle my anger at this situation, so I'm going to take it out in the only way I know possible. So, does that make sense to everybody? Okay. So some creative anger management strategies. I probably should have phrased that differently because it's look like I'm going to make you creative at expressing your anger. So what's been found to work best is cognitive coping strategies, relaxation techniques, and even behavior modifications to deal with those three components. And so in terms of some specific strategies, know your anger style. So I would say probably we all fit to some degree in one of the four we just discussed. And sometimes depending on the relationship with the person or structure, system that we're angry with, we may have a different style of anger expression. So just be aware of it. Know your style. Learn to monitor and de-escalate your anger. So we talked about the physiological feelings that we may experience in our bodies. And if you know that your temperature is starting to rise, what can you do to help decrease that a little bit? Do you need to take some deep breaths? Do you need to leave the room? Do you need to maybe close your eyes for a second and envision a relaxing place so you can center yourself again? Which kind of goes into learning to outthink your anger. Also, getting comfortable with all your feelings and then learning to express them constructively is really important. Also, being able to plan ahead is valuable. I know those things that are going to frustrate me and even maybe lead me to feeling angry. So if I can prepare myself to interact with a person or an experience, or if I can avoid it entirely, if that's what's most appropriate, then I can sort of expect to be able to do that. Develop a support system is really valuable. And this is not to have somebody to help sort of vent to, but to be able to find support and maybe talk to about the best way to go about being direct with your frustration or anger if you're going to confront somebody or talk to them about it. Develop realistic expectations of yourself and others. Learn problem-solving techniques. Stay in shape is important. I talked about the hormones that come up when we experience a fight or flight response. The most effective way to burn those off is to do physical exercise. So you want to get your heart rate up, you want to sweat a little bit, if you're a person that can sweat easily, and then that can help sort of moderate that system in and of itself. Consider turning complaints into a request, which is sometimes tricky, but just imagine what it might be like to come to a scenario where you're sort of presenting with open hands of, let's figure this out together. What might this look like? How can we do things differently? Forgiveness makes past anger pass. And this is sometimes really complicated, especially if there's not an opportunity to express your anger or frustration to the person or thing that's done it. So sometimes you have to get to a point within yourself where you work to forgive that particular slight or transgression. Are there any anger strategies that you all have tried before that have been pretty effective? No? Okay. Oh, you're good.
I generally like to just walk around, calm down. Sometimes I'll listen to some music, sing along to it.
That's great, yeah.
Just get my voice out. Say something.
Yeah, that's awesome. Very good. Do any more? That's good. You're good? Okay. So now we'll talk a little bit about fear. And this one, I think, I see the most in a clinical setting, and this is often synonymous with anxiety. So we'll kind of talk about it within that framework. In terms of fear, like anger, fear is an element of survival. And it's in its most primitive form, fear stimulates a physical response to flee or hide from a threat. And these threats can be intimidating, overwhelming, and sometimes fatal. So often described as a state of anxiety, fear comes in many shades, and these are just some options of them. You can probably get out a thesaurus and build off all of these, and they would all kind of fit into that fear realm. So also, if I refer to fear as anxiety, that's because of their close relationship. Just know that I'm talking about the same thing. So, like anger, chronic anxiety and fear produces physiological adaptations created by a stress response. So constantly having those hormones running through your body can have really negative physiological consequences. With fear specifically, it can have a huge impact on your immune system. So if you've ever felt really stressed or anxious about something and then soon after you got sick, there's a good chance that there's a direct connection between your kind of catching that cold or illness and your immune system, which was related directly to your stress at the time. Any of you get sick after finals week? After midterms? Yeah? Okay. It's very similar to that. So repeated episodes of fear can make us more vulnerable to illnesses overall and to even acne outbreaks. These are all pieces to that, which we just love talking about acne in college, right? So the current school of thought suggests that fears are not instinctual, and the reason, the fear response is, but the fears that we create from this fear response is not. But rather they're learned and a response from one or more exposure to an event that resulted in an amount of physical or emotional pain. So it's sort of, if you're familiar with anything from psychology, like conditioning, when you shock somebody, they'll eventually start, after you turn on a light, they're eventually going to start to fear the light, but not the shock, even if there's not even if they're not shocked each time with the light. So it's that kind of thing. Sometimes it can be something really big, and it only has to happen once, and then it becomes a constant fear. Other times it can be just those little needling things that happen, and it could be feedback from a parent or the messages that they send. And at first it wasn't hard to deal with, but eventually it starts to become this nagging sense of concern and difficulty challenging things. So for this reason, the anxiety is usually categorized as either rational or useful, or irrational, also known as useless. And we'll talk a little bit more about those. In terms of useful fears, these are fears stimulated by real events that are life-threatening and require a response to survive. That's pretty cut and dry. Now, the tricky part becomes with irrational fears. These are often imagined, exaggerated, or distorted threats that override our cognitive processes in our higher brain centers. And what that means is, like, we've got a lot of systems in our brain that help us be our upright, walking, creative, imagining, future-oriented beings. But sometimes those things, like I mentioned, can work against us, and we can create scenarios that feel threatening based on previous threatening scenarios that may or may not happen. And that's sort of that exaggerated sense of fear. It's like, a lot of times what I talk about with clients and other folks is this idea of what-ifing. So you can what-if yourself almost to death, because there are tons of scenarios out there that could happen. But the reality is, what is in this moment should be all that matters. Now, I'm not saying don't think about your career, don't think about classes, those kind of things, but just imagine what it would be like to just live in the now to the best of your ability, considering some of the things that are reasonable. So again, the irrational fears sometimes produce negative self-talk. And again, going back to this kind of self-esteem component that goes along with the fight or flight response and the stress that can come from it. When you start to denigrate yourself and demean yourself because you feel like you're not good enough to survive, then that can be pretty problematic for you in the long run. So so when we experience anger, a rush of adrenaline often accompanies it, but fear is a draining emotion. And if you can imagine sort of just someone kind of crawling under a desk and hiding, that is fear, and pretty well captures people. And it's protective and important, but when it's happening all the time, that tends to prevent you from being a capable, functioning member of society. So after fear often comes worry, and you go back to the irrational, rational, useful, useless fears. And worries that become chronic in nature tend to become self-defeating. A lot of this time I can see it manifesting in like belief in self. I can be successful. I can do these things effectively. But when you're afraid that you might not, then it tends to be like, okay, so I won't try anymore. I don't think I can do this, so I won't even bother. So kind of similar to anger, the rumination process with fears don't often work. It just becomes this like hamster wheel of thoughts and concerns, and you just spin and spin and spin and spin, and you don't get anywhere. So rather than perpetuating by the emotional energy that we're putting into them. Yes. Okay. So there are 6 basic human fears, and almost everything that we experience or we're afraid of can be lumped into these categories in one way or another. And if you think about this from a clinical perspective with anxiety, these tend to be the ones that you see folks present with when they're talking about feeling anxious. And I will break each of these down and talk more about them, so if you don't get the whole list, that's okay. So the first one is fear of failure. So this is often associated with low self-esteem. And the fear of failure is a conditioned response. Think about the light, the shock, and the person. The fear becomes of the light, not necessarily the shock each time. So fear of failure is a conditioned response from a past experience where one's performance didn't meet their own expectations. So even though sometimes one might say to themselves, well, my dad or my mom expects me to get this degree in engineering, and they expect me to get all A's, but I didn't, so I'm a failure. You have then taken their messages and internalized them for yourself. So you're kind of believing them, and that's sort of where that comes from. So that's why it's your own expectation. Failure is often associated with lack of achievement, when in reality, it tends to be caused, the failure itself, by a lack of effort. So going back to that self-talk, we think we will not be able to accomplish a successful goal, so we're not even going to try. And then you don't succeed because you didn't try in the first place. Is that kind of making sense? How that fits in? Okay. So the next piece is fear of rejection, and this is very relational, of course. So fear of rejection is also associated with low self-worth. But this fear involves your perception of how others perceive and support and accept you, whereas the fear of failure is based only on self-acceptance. So these seeds of fear of rejection tend to be sown early in life when we seek love and support from our parents or authority figures, but then it is not met for some reason. And there can be various reasons why this happens. And it can be very difficult to kind of go back in time and understand where that's coming from. So rejection only becomes anxiety when lack of approval or acceptance supports one inner thought of one's low self-esteem. So again, if you believe that you're not worth it, and then you interact with somebody, and you ask somebody out on a date, and they're like, no, I don't like you like that. And it's like, I knew I wasn't worth it. When in reality, it's just that one person. But it's feeding into that fear as it goes. So the next one, and actually a couple, they're pretty similar, so I'll cover both of them at once. So the third one is the fear of the unknown, which the other fears kind of make more sense because you have something that you are kind of looking at and you can fight against or even challenge. But the fear of the unknown is literally that. You have no idea what to expect. Lots of times this comes up for students I work with who are seniors who will be graduating and maybe don't have a job yet. What am I going to do with my life? I don't know. Let's figure that out. And a lot of that has to do with gaining a sense of competency, and that even though you may not know exactly what you're doing, you have tools in your toolbox to manage this effectively and make a plan for what to do. And then kind of along those same lines, it's like fear of the unknown, and then like the big one's fear of death. Generally, people don't want to die. And for those folks that do want to die, we have clinical interventions for that sort of thing. And so the fear of death falls into the domain of useful fears when we're in jeopardy. I would like to say that right now, physically in this room, and then also on the folks watching this on Zoom, you're not in danger, I would hope. I can say that pretty confidently for the people in the room at least. But if you were afraid and constantly thinking like, I'm going to die and I'm afraid of that, that might be problematic, and this is sort of where this fear comes from. And it's sort of when it becomes this whole fabric of the cloth idea, where all you can see is this worry and fear about death, that it does become problematic. And oftentimes these are the type of folks who are excessively cautious, and they don't, not that they don't take risks in a positive way, but it's just they don't want to do much of anything for fear that they will die. And I think one challenging thing with this particular fear is that we will, in fact, all die someday. It is an inevitability, because none of us get out of this alive. But sort of accepting that as a known fact of humanity that hopefully many people find peace in. So I think that's what I'll say about death for now. So the next one is fear of isolation. So fear of isolation is a fear of being left alone, and may very well be one of the first fears we develop in life. So when we're infants and we cry, when we need something, we are activating somebody to come be with us and cutting off that isolation. So in childhood, we need to have people around us because we can't take care of ourselves. But then as we become adults and self-sufficient, we still need people around us to be supportive and care for us. And when we don't have those people for whatever reason, our quality of life literally starts to decrease significantly. So if you don't have a strong support network, I would strongly recommend seeing how to cultivate that as best as possible. And if you need assistance, certainly you can come to the counseling center and we will help with that. Then the last one is fear of the loss of self-dominance. And this is basically a fancy way of saying when we worry about losing control of major life events. You'll see this lots of times in folks who become new parents. There's a huge shift. It's like if it's a heterosexual couple and she's been carrying the baby for 9 months and there's huge emotional preparation and you have things in your house, but that doesn't change the fact or kind of protect against the fact that you suddenly have this new being that needs a lot of your attention. And that shifts your dynamics in the couple and even what your sense of individuality and your understanding of yourself. So this can be sometimes a phase of life experience. So, does that make sense, those fear pieces? Okay. Strategies to overcome fear. So something all interventions have in common is the idea that fear, whatever it is, must be confronted at some level. And this is hard when you think about what you do with anxiety, you try to avoid. But it's, the only way to sort of overcome it is to confront it. Like think about the boogie monster or the knight and the dragons. Like you cannot run away forever. You have to eventually turn and face it. And usually I'd say when that happens, it is sort of that fairy tale idea where you do defeat that dragon. And if you don't do it the first time, you can call in reinforcements and they can help you defeat it together. So some of the ways to consider that is to explore childhood and understand possible scenarios that may have fostered some of the fears that we have. Also engaging in coping strategies and relaxation in order to control the anxiety and physiological responses we may be having. And then also repeated exposure to the fear, so systematic desensitization. One simple example, I guess, is arachnophobia or fear of spiders. Some people are petrified even at the thought of a spider. So with this systematic desensitization, what you're doing is you're doing small exposures at varying levels. So you start by just saying the word spider, and then kind of managing the distress that goes along with it, up into the point where ideally the person is then holding and touching a spider without that physiological fear response because it's not dangerous. Does that kind of make sense? That one I feel like some people probably have heard of before. So in terms of anger and fear's connection with depression, as I mentioned earlier, we have sadness. Sadness oftentimes is another emotion like anger that people don't like to experience, but is hard to avoid. And with depression specifically, this is sort of that unresolved stress component. So those who have studied this experience describe depression as anger turned inward, which I kind of mentioned. That's why they sort of believe that women have higher rates of depression than men, because women, we turn this inward onto ourselves. And then thinking about anger as some unmet need, clinicians and researchers have found it's essential to resolve these concerns in order for the depression to be lifted. Sometimes it takes some digging, because when you feel just this weight of sadness all the time, it's hard to be able to confront a more intense emotion like anger, but maybe that's the root of what's going on because you didn't have that need met effectively. Let's see. Some just normalizing things. It's typical for us to feel down every once in a while, but when you have prolonged experiences, when it's all you experience all day, every day, that's not normal or healthy. And this is sort of where you can call in those reinforcements and get some professional assistance, or even do some work on your own. Like, there's lots of great stuff out there on the internet that can help sort of start the wheels turning if you were able to see somebody professionally. Again, going back to that professional aspect, so balance between positive and negative feelings. So you don't want to ever only feel positive emotions. You do need to have that balance of some more negative emotions like sadness, anger, fear, because these are all normal, healthy parts of being a human. Let me go back one. So any questions about those pieces? This is pretty brief on depression. Focus a lot on anxiety. Okay. So the last slide. Some recommendations that I have for folks is to allow yourself to experience all your emotions. They're all valuable, even if they're hard sometimes and you're not sure how to manage them. Just sort of saying to yourself, it's okay that I'm angry right now, can almost in and of itself be soothing and calming to that anger. And even sadness, it's okay that I'm sad, it's okay that I'm afraid. We often don't have to tell ourselves it's okay I'm happy, but if you need to do that, please do it. And if you know you don't express your emotions effectively, practice new and healthy ways of expressing them. And we talked a little bit about those as far as the anger. And with the fear piece, it's a lot about confronting and get the support you need in order to do that. And then also have some compassion for yourself. If these are some of the things you want to work on for yourself, or if you know somebody who you would want to recommend watch this video down the road, it's important to know that the things that you might be trying to change didn't happen overnight. So you're probably not going to be able to effectively change the world overnight for yourself. So having some compassion to take your time and be willing to make mistakes and acknowledge those, but to continue trying is what's important. So that's all I have for you today. Do you all have any questions or anything? No? Okay. Do you have a thought, or are you just processing stuff? Okay. All right. So then, thank you all for coming.